Hello and welcome to another Giant Slayer TFT Top 5 Countdown video. Today I'll be counting down the top 5 compositions for all of Set 5. With the new set just around the corner, we're taking a look back to see what were the best traits, compositions, and champions for all of Set 5. The criteria for best compositions is all about consistency through the whole set, so flash in the pan builds won't be making it onto this list, but they may show up in our honorable mentions. With that, let's go ahead and get started. But before we begin, please don't forget to click the links in our description. Give your support to everyone who helped make this video happen. We host many TFT tournaments with plenty of exciting content to come, so be sure to also follow our Giant Slayer TFT social media pages. Alright, let's get back to the video. Starting off our top 5, we have Lucian Sentinel coming in at number 5. As we mentioned in the intro, our main criteria for the list is consistency throughout all of Set 5. Even though Sentinel wasn't in the first half of Set 5, it's still been such a powerhouse composition that we had to have a spot for it. There's no doubt that the consistency of Sentinel showcased throughout the mid-set put it on the same level as every other comp that we'll be discussing today. But why was Sentinel so good? And what made Lucian such a top-tier carry? The answer for those questions comes down mostly to the synergy between Sentinel and its champions. Getting a shield that applies an attack speed buff that rotates to the lowest health champion guarantees clutch moments where a champion about to die instead survives. Or the fact Lucian, who scales with attack speed, gets an insane boost at the beginning of combat with the Sentinel buff. Akshan also benefited greatly from the Sentinel trait, especially since he was often one of the last champions alive, guaranteeing him the shield. Talking about the trait itself, we can't ignore the champions. Sentinel benefited a lot from having viable champions throughout the whole game, ranging from the skirmisher duo in the early game with Aurelia and Olaf, to the mid game with Lucian and Galio, into the late game where Akshan shined. Plus, a lot of those champions synergized well, such as Lucian and Senna being Cannoneer and the aforementioned Aurelia-Olaf pair. By far, the two main stars of the Sentinel show were Lucian and Galio. Galio quickly became the all-around best frontliner, whether with Sentinel or without it. A tank that can taunt, heal, and deal a lot of damage? Yeah, that's kinda good. For Lucian, it was all about the damage output, as even at tier 1, he dished out a ton of damage. That damage, coupled with how easy it was to hit 6 Sentinel, meant stabilizing in stage 4 was quite easy. Being able to play a 1-star carry and a vertical synergy meant level 8 was just around the corner, where the player could finish upgrading their board and hit a major power spike. Overall, Sentinel was a bit boring. It was another vertical synergy that did its job all too well. But we're not here to critique how fun a composition was, we're here to say whether the build was one of the best, and Lucian Sentinel certainly was. Let's move on to the next composition that comes in at number 4, Abomination. We've already discussed Abomination in our top 10 traits of Set 5, so we won't go too much into what makes the trait good. Instead, we want to highlight the fact that Abomination survived so many metas throughout the set because of how easy it paired with other traits. When you think of Abomination, what comes to mind? The monstrosity charges down the enemy backline, Nunu chomping down a frontliner, or Fiddlesticks jumping into the backline. The main visual that pops up consistently is the number of viable champions and traits that were played alongside of Abomination. Draconic was able to flourish with Abomination, especially when Zyra 3 was a viable carry. Even without Zyra, another Draconic champion that made up the bulk of late game Abomination boards was Heimerdinger. Heimerdinger ruled the late game for quite a few metas, though he did fall off in the end after several nerfs. But even so, the times Heimerdinger was relevant meant Invoker, Draconic, Revenant, and a bunch of other synergies were also relevant. Then there was Brand Carry, albeit not so much with Abomination, but still viable. More likely, though, was Vel'Koz, a champion that fit in nice and snug with the other Abomination champions. And then there's a whole lot of other minor variations that would take far too long to go over. The point is that Abomination facilitated a ton of different compositions throughout Set 5. Few other compositions had that kind of staying power, and that's what earns Abomination a spot in our top 5. With that, we can move on to our number 3 composition, Yasuo Nightbringer. Consistency is the key to our top 5, and Yasuo was all around the most consistent 3-cost carry of Set 5. Sure, there were plenty of times where Yasuo fell off due to nerfs or meta shifts, but even after the mid-set with the loss of Dragon Slayer, Yasuo remained playable. As it turns out, giving a champion an attack speed trait plus a trait based around survivability on top of dealing true damage makes her a pretty darn good carry. It is worth noting that Yasuo was almost never the best composition in the meta. Instead, Yasuo Nightbringer was always a go-to option when a player had the right board for it, and almost always led to a consistent top 4. And as we've said, and we'll keep saying over and over, consistency is what matters. Another interesting tidbit about the composition is that it really didn't change all that much over the course of Set 5. Sure, Dragon Slayer was removed in the mid-set alongside Morgana, so there was definitely a shift in how it was played. But overall, the general goal of the board was the same. On Yasuo, toss in 4 to 6 Nightbringer and some Legionnaires, and roll at level 7 for Yasuo 3. That may not sound like a big deal, but it is because it meant the further along we got into set 5, the better players got at optimizing a Yasuo composition. It also meant for more casual or newer players, they could always look up a reliable composition to play. That's an underrated aspect because TFT is a game that is constantly evolving and changing with new sets and a 2-week patch cycle. Not to mention the fact that set 5 had more overall patches due to the increased number of hotfixes and B patches. So when we all look back on TFT a few months from now, or even longer, Yasuo Nightbringer should be a fond memory of set 5. Up next, we have Vel'Koz coming in as the number 2 composition. The Laser Squid really brought it in set 5, though we admit there are plenty of times where he was absent from the meta. Vel'Koz was an interesting champion in set 5 because players either loved him or hated him. There was rarely ever a middle ground. When he was strong, it was either a blessing or a curse depending on the player. A lot of that came down to the coin flip nature of how Vel'Koz functioned, as proper positioning meant wiping the enemy board, while the receiving end of the laser often didn't feel that great, like you got unlucky. Whether you're the type of player that enjoyed Vel'Koz or not, the fact is he was a mainstay of set 5. And Vel'Koz survived through a lot of metas because of how easy it was to adapt him into a new composition. The two most common are definitely Abomination and Redeemed, though there are definitely a ton of other variations as well. Abomination we've already talked about a lot, but it was the perfect board to pair with Vel'Koz. It provided Spellweaver with Brand, a solid frontline, and provided the player with multiple positioning options. Redeemed was hit or miss, but the general idea with Redeemed was stacking a ton of defensive stats into one board to buy time for Vel'Koz to laser everyone down. And of course, it also provided scaling to Vel'Koz, so when he was the last one alive, he'd usually win the round with increased stats. Not to mention that Redeemed had amazing champions like Rel in the front line, Syndra to toss away any pesky assassins, and Lux with her shields. More than likely, Vel'Koz will go down in set 5 history as one of the most controversial champions due to the player base splitting between loving and hating him. Regardless of that, it's clear Vel'Koz boards were a consistent part of the set 5 meta. And finally, we have the number 1 composition for all of set 5, Dawnbringer. Yes, that's right, Dawnbringer is our number 1 pick. There's no question that Dawnbringer was not only a consistent composition throughout set 5, but it was one of the strongest at multiple points in the meta. Remember when vertical traits consistently dominated prior to the mid-set release? 6 Dawnbringer was the best of those builds. But we do admit that after the mid-set came out, Dawnbringer did falter a bit. More so Karma than anything, but Dawnbringer was more than just Karma. Of course, Karma is the most prolific version of Dawnbringer, but throughout set 5, there have been multiple viable compositions. Riven consistently made a name for herself as a capable 3-cost carry with multiple variations ranging from 2 to 6 Dawnbringer. Soraka Reroll had a few moments in the sun. And of course, the best named composition utilized Dawnbringer with Chug Jug and the Chug Bug variation. Dawnbringer also did well throughout the whole game with a strong early game, a great mid game with Riven and Nidalee as item carries, and a powerful late game built around Karma and Garen. Karma Dawnbringer is definitely the composition that will come to mind for anyone thinking back about set 5, since that was the main composition to play, especially in the last few patches of Reckoning. Dawnbringer definitely deserves the title of best all-around composition, given how consistent it remained. And that's it for our top 5 compositions of set 5. But before we go, we've got a few honorable mentions to talk about. These compositions weren't quite as consistent as our top 5, but certainly made names for themselves. First up, we have Assassins. We debated putting Assassins in the top 5, but the issue with various Assassin compositions that dotted the set 5 meta was, of course, consistency. Most of the time when Assassin did well, it was immediately nerfed, either in a B patch or the next major patch. Remember how dominant LeBlanc was in the initial release of set 5? Then they quickly stomped that variation into the ground, which was promptly followed by Katarina carry, which was also then stomped into the ground. After that, the mid-set arrived, removing both Katarina and LeBlanc and putting the sole carry potential onto Nocturne. And Nocturne did do well here and there, but never consistently enough. Because of how quickly they quelled Assassin compositions, we never really got to see them become truly dominant in the meta. Definitely an impactful composition, just not quite up there with our top 5 builds. Our next honorable mention is Bulldozer. Bulldozer was not the strongest composition when it was viable, and it quickly left the meta after the mid-set removed Pantheon. We want to acknowledge it mainly for how unique of a build it was. Rarely in set 5 do champions synergize with other champions outside of their respective traits. Bulldozer did this thanks to the interaction between Varus and Pantheon. Despite how short-lived this build was, it was definitely a lasting impression. Next up is Hellions. It would be shameful if we didn't at least mention Hellions because they were by far the quintessential reroll composition of set 5. There was a brief time where a Hellion composition opener led to a fast 9, but in general, the only times where a Hellion composition was viable was when players were rerolling. Because of that, we crowned Hellions the top reroll composition of set 5, but sadly, that's not enough to make it into our top 5. No, we haven't forgotten about Forgotten, it's just that this composition never truly took off in the meta. There were certainly plenty of times when it did well, between Vayne dominating the early weeks of set 5 or the Misfortune Cavalier composition. But in general, Forgotten never felt like a mainstay build in the meta, and a lot of that came down to Draven. Draven was meant to be the Forgotten carry, but that didn't come to pass. Instead, Draven was mostly a Legionnaire lackey. Sure, Forgotten was an option, but the fact the main carry of Forgotten wasn't tied to the synergy meant there was never consistency for Forgotten. More than likely, players will look back on Forgotten and think of how insane Vayne was with Jeweled Gauntlet in the early days of the set. And our final honorable mention is Rangers. Rangers had a rough time in set 5 because Aphelios was such a diva to play. In Reckoning, the only viable way to run Aphelios was by finding Kindred. In Dawn of Heroes, it was a bit easier to play Aphelios, but the optimal build still used a ton of 4 and 5 cost champions and hinged on perfect items for fighting Akshan. Of course, there were other Ranger variations like Vayne Reroll, Ashe 3, and Varus 3, but those weren't really Ranger boards. Vayne mainly ran with Forgotten, Ashe was a very niche build late in the mid-set with Draconic, and Varus generally played with Redeemed. Aphelios was the Ranger carry, and sadly, Aphelios never truly lived up to the task. That said, Aphelios Ranger did have its time in the meta where it did well, particularly after the mid-set, where they changed his ability to deal a massive amount of damage. And Rangers were a viable option throughout the mid-set, though we could never call them that consistent. If there were a few more favorable patches towards Rangers, we may have seen them in our top 5, but sadly, it never happened. And that's it for today, folks. Set 5 as a whole was relatively diverse in the amount of viable compositions. That said, a lot of builds definitely kept to a particular theme, like having a strong 4-cost carry or utilizing a vertical synergy. Keep an eye out for our next Set 5 video where we cover the overall top 10 champions. Let us know in the comment section below what your top 5 compositions are for Set 5. Thank you for watching, and if you're enjoying our content, be sure to hit the like button and subscribe for future Giant Slayer TFT videos.